they got
Yes.
a ferry because there's,
You know, in our day and age, we believe that
they watch
God
this.
is a covenant with the church, but we also believe that it's a personal covenant with us. Did people from this time period just believe that the covenant was for their tribe or their people, or did they think that they had a personal relationship with God?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's a fascinating question. So the question was, as we're reading these texts, would the understanding be that the covenant is with the entire people writ large, or would they also see an individual responsibility? And, there's no single way to answer that, but clearly what happens as you work your way temporally through the Old Testament era is that you have a growing sense of individual responsibility. I mean, there's always kind of that corporate identity. I mean, the idea that the king acts on behalf of the people. But there's some famous passages. I'll make a note tomorrow when we talk about sin. This will be a great time. We're all familiar with the things of the sons will suffer from the sins of the fathers in the fourth and fifth generation. But there are some very specific passages in Jeremiah and Ezekiel. So now we're on the time of the Babylonian exile, where the saying was, the parents eat sour grapes and the children's teeth, like when you bite something sour. We translated their teeth set on edge. The point is just the parents, eat something sour and the kids go, ugh. In other words, right, the parents do something, the kids suffer. And so in Jeremiah it says, no longer will it be the case that the parents eat sour grapes and the children, the parents will purse their lips, because it sounds less like a goofy saying, but it's a huge thing. And in Ezekiel too, you get the same thing. This growing awareness of individual responsibility. You will be the one who will suffer for your actions. And so that's a little bit of a follow-up to your question of, is there this kind of individual relationship? We just have to remember, though, that individual, as we use the word today, is very much the product of the last couple hundred years. That our sense of individuality, would have knocked these folks for a loop. I am my own, and we probably do it to a fault. And so the idea, though, that, as you said, today in the church we're in covenant, but we always are part of the body of Christ. So it's never that we have a unique personal covenant with God that isn't somehow part and parcel. We can feel that way, but I think we feel that way to the detriment of the body of Christ. So that's a fascinating question for that individual aspect. We'll look at some of that tomorrow. Yeah.
What is the covenant and right way in his covenant? Does he have
He doesn't, does anyone know, he doesn't remove the old covenant. Remember the word that gets used? He fulfills it, so we'll look, yeah. But you're definitely right, there's a transition, it's not like we're just back where we always were. It's this idea, though, of a fulfillment. And then, of course, that raises the question, well, what does it mean to fulfill, And that's the beauty of a relationship, right? It's not a true-false test. It's a constantly evolving, enriching, and we're either attentive to it or we just let it ossify and we slowly goes cold, like any relationship. You can live to that. Okay, so sometimes with Noah it's referred to as a promise because God just makes this promise and it doesn't seem to be a two-sided covenant. But the fact of the matter is the word in the Bible is the word, let the Bible be the Bible, and that's the word they use. So maybe we're the ones who have to rethink, what we say about covenant. So let's go on to Abraham. Next very famous covenant situation. So Abraham, we looked at this one last night, Genesis 15, where fertility, right, it's impossible to think of the covenant with Abraham without thinking about the situation of fertility. It's all about this guy's left everything, being given the promise that he will be the father of, an uncountable family, basically. So in Genesis 15, verse 2, Abram saying, Lord, what can you give me? If I die childless, what's the point? There's nothing you can give me that can make me feel good if I want to have a kid. And then he takes them out. Verse 5. He took them outside, look up at the sky, count the stars, just so will your descendants be. I brought you up from the land of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land as a possession. Then Abraham, right? Abraham's a good dealer. He says, look, how will I know that I will possess it? He answered him, bring me, here's what someone was asking about the bring. Bring me a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, a young pigeon. He brought all these and split them in two, okay? Wow, saws them in half. Placed each opposite the other, but the birds he did not cut up. Why? That's not entirely clear. Birds of prey swooped down on the carcasses, but Abram scared them away. As the sun was about to set, the deep silence fell upon Abram, and a great dark dread descended upon him. The idea of cutting the things in half was, if you broke the covenant, the understanding was that's what was going to happen to you. Okay, so along with the symbolism that there's two halves, just like there's two parties to a covenant, but it's also a little bit of a threat, or maybe not so little, that this will happen to you. So God says, Abraham says, what's my sign? You know, why should I trust you? He goes, here, cut these things up. Well, that isn't as random as it might sound. I mean, that was the understood way you did shake hands, you cut a cow in half. Then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your descendants will reside as aliens in a land of their own, where they shall be enslaved. So notice he's promised them all this, offspring. Basically he's predicting the whole Egyptian slavery thing. So if you were Abram, you might be thinking at this point, well, this isn't exactly sweetening the pot. You're telling me that all these wonderful descendants of mine will be slaves. Then verse 14, but I will bring judgment on the nation they must serve, and after this they will go out with great wealth. So it's always this, there's always strings attached. Yes, they'll be fine, they'll be wealthy, but they have to be slaves for 400 years. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace. In other words, saying, look, this is all the way down the road, Abram, don't worry, you'll die in your bed. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace. You will be buried at a ripe old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will return here, for the wickedness of the Amorites is not yet complete. You're getting woven in all these historical, we shouldn't think that someone just sat down with a blank piece of paper and started writing Genesis 1 to, so all this rich history, some of which, we've long since lost the memory of. But then when the sun set and it was dark, there appeared a smoking fire pot, right? We used to translate this brazier, and a flaming torch which passed between those pieces. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your descendants I give this land, from the Wadi of Egypt to the great river Euphrates, right? A huge stretch of land. The land of the Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaim, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. So once again, what is God's promise? What's his end of the deal? Yeah, a little slavery tossed in there, but descendants and land. What does Abraham have to do? Die peacefully in his sleep, and have kids. So this incredible promise of God. Now, Abraham certainly has done a lot. He left everything. He came to this strange land. But once again, the word covenant is used, but it's very much, just a wonderful promise of God's bounty and fidelity. And wouldn't Abraham's descendants be happy if it was only chapter 15? But in chapter 17, we get another account of the covenant.
And you still call Abram.
That's right.
Sarah.
Sarai, yeah. So what you're seeing here are different levels. Well, again, we can never definitively say, right? Someone could always come and say, no, it was written just exactly like this, and we don't have the authors here. But what is generally thought is that the Pentateuch has many layers of how it was put together. So the fact that you have 2 accounts of the covenant with Abraham may represent 2 different remembered traditions. And just like is it Abram, here it's Abraham. And So how it's remembered. So if you want to do a very strict, literal reading of the Bible, you've got to try and figure out, how do I make sense out of all this? Because sometimes there seem to be contradictions. Certainly the Catholic Church doesn't require you to read it that way. It's perfectly acceptable to see this as a growing literary composition where you have different, clearly they're talking about the same person, they're talking basically about the same facts, but you never had, the meeting of minds and everyone getting down to say, okay, this is going to be the final version that we have. But that does not fly in the face of Revelation or mean that these aren't inspired texts. That's a whole other conversation, but it's an important one. So in 17, now Abram's 99, and it's almost as if what we just read, hasn't happened yet. Because as I said, one way of understanding this is that what you're getting is just another telling of the same event. Abram fell face down, verse 2, between you and me I will establish my covenant and I will multiply you exceedingly. Okay, so the same basic promise. But now, Abram here, he falls face down out of reverence. He's not quite the same plucky Abram who likes to sort of verbally spar with God. So again, maybe this is a somewhat different tradition of how Abram was remembered. We don't know it, we can't prove it, it's just a speculation. But this business about, God just says one thing and Abram falls down, doesn't mean, I'm not trying to suggest, it says what it says. For my part, here is my covenant with you. You are to become the father of a multitude of nations. No longer will you be called Abram, your name will be Abraham, for I am making you a father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fertile, right? The word fertility is explicitly mentioned here. Goes on and on and on, talks about all the descendants, he's going to give them a bunch of land. This is the covenant between me and you and your descendants after you. Now, if you just stopped it there, you'd have Genesis 15. But he goes on. But for you, there's something you have to do. Every male among you shall be circumcised. Circumcise the flesh of your foreskin. That will be the sign of the covenant between me and you. Throughout the ages, every male among you, when he is 8 days old, shall be circumcised, including house-born slaves and those acquired with money from any foreigner who is not of your descendants. Yes, both the house-born slaves and those bought will be circumcised. Thus my covenant will be in your flesh as an everlasting covenant. If a male is uncircumcised, that is, if the flesh of his foreskin has not been cut away, such a one will be cut off from his people. He has broken my covenant. Now, if you had to choose between 15 and 17, which one would you want? So there's quite a difference there. But 17 really stresses the fact that in this understanding of covenant, there are two sides. You got to do your part, I got to do my part. And the importance of the sign, yes, it's very graphic, but it's graphic because it's so permanent. You're not going to undo that. It is marked in your flesh. It is a sign for everyone to instantly be able to know, you are of this covenant. And so in this case, it's not reminding God to do anything, but it's as if it's reminding the people that they are of this people of God, right? So if some foreigner comes along, it'd be easy to tell that they're not of our people. So a very different, the same basic idea that Abraham would be the father of many people, but the covenantal understanding is literally, markedly different. Yes?
There's always an outward sign that points to something.
Well, the signs of the covenant generally are, you can say there's an internal significance to it as well. But yeah, the idea of the sign of the covenant is that it's literally something you see. Exactly. It's the rainbow, it's circumcision, it's the breaking of the bread. That's why when we gather for Mass, we literally have to break bread and drink, transform wine. If we just sit around and read the story and think about it, we don't have the sign of the covenant. Great question. And yet, there certainly is an interior awareness and that sort of thing. This idea of the covenant marked in flesh is so important because a little bit later, we're going to see another sign where covenant is marked on flesh. But We'll get there. We'll get there. So now this is a good setup for what probably most of us think, or if you just stop the average person on the street, of kind of the classic example of the covenant with God, and that would namely be Moses and Exodus. So we don't have time to look at that. If you've never sat down and read Exodus cover to cover, I'd encourage you to do it. A lot of times people are surprised how many versions of the so-called 10 Commandments there are. There aren't always 10 of them. There's all kinds of repetition. My favorite part of the book of Exodus is where God tries to kill Moses. If any of you have read that one. But it's a teaser for you. Well, Moses, he makes it, but no, very explicitly, God just comes down and tries to murder him. Which again is maybe one of these strange stories that has been preserved. Exodus, even more than Deuteronomy, is this patchwork of all these different. So it's anything but the movie where you just get this very clean narrative. We start here, we end there. All those pieces are in it, but it's just kind of like a blender almost in certain areas. But let's just look at some classic texts. Right from the beginning, Exodus starts with a covenantal remembering on the part of God. Right? So we know the basic story. At the end of Genesis, we've got Joseph. The story of Joseph and his brothers. Joseph is down there in Egypt. What is it that sends Joseph's brothers down to Egypt, where they actually discover that he's become Pharaoh's right-hand man? Famine. Okay? There's our old, not friend, our old enemy. It's infertility, right? When you look at famine, you've got to think of the land being infertile. Don't just think, oh, the crops were bad, too bad for us. This is the primal curse. Famine is the infertility of creation. And it's out of infertility that, the patriarchs, the descendants of the patriarchs, Abraham's people, are forced into slavery. Remember, God promised to Abraham, he said, your great-great-great-great-grandkids are going to be slaves for 400 years. Well, how did they get there? The infertility of the land drove them there. Okay. So now they're there, and as we all know, things don't go so well after Joseph leaves the scene. But then what happens? Well, they're struggling, they're suffering. And right there in Exodus 2, what's that?
There's a baby in a basket.
That's right, baby in a basket. Tension between those words that are almost intranslatable. So, burning bush, right? We just had this in, well, not just, we had it earlier in the summer for daily mass readings. So, Exodus 2, verse 23. A long time passed, during which the king of Egypt died. Okay? That's important because the king of Egypt was Joseph's supporter. The Israelites groaned under their bondage and cried out from their bondage. Their cry for help went up to God. God heard their moaning, and God was mindful of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God saw the Israelites, and God knew. See what's going on there? As the cry of the people in slavery in Egypt goes up to God, he hears it, and when he hears it, he remembers. He remembers his covenant. Now, it's not like at some point we saw your cry would be the sign of the covenant. I get that. But it's this idea that a covenant is remembered. A covenant is meant to be remembered. And we get that for ourselves, right? What good is having a covenant or a contract if nobody remembers that it's there? And aren't you lucky if you find one, or you find the will, or whatever, and all of a sudden, okay. So, again, this is not scholastic theology. This is relational, dirt under your fingernails, real lived experience. God is, oh, were you guys down there as slaves? I lost track of you. Now I hear your cries. So I'm remembering the covenant. And now we're off to the races because we know Moses, baby in the basket, burning bush, and all the rest of it. But the point is, it's so easy to forget with all the drama that Exodus is, what starts the whole ball rolling is God being reminded of his covenant relationship. Yes, you were in slavery there for that long time, but I heard the cries of the people, and I'm remembering what I had promised to Abraham, to Isaac, and Jacob. Can you do the whole Exodus thing without remembering that? Yeah, but you've really cut the legs out from under the whole beauty and the power, that it is an ongoing relationship. Can we, in our non-biblical lives, feel like God has forgotten his covenant? Well, boy, I've sure met a lot of folks who can, and I've been there myself. And we don't use this language, perhaps, but to feel that somehow, God, are you there? God, and it's pretty cold comfort just to go back to your favorite theology book, which tells you you are unconditionally loved by God 24/7. Do you experience it? Are you able to access that relationship? There are ways to do it, but it just matters. So they're crying out to God and he's hearing. Then let's look at the actual Sinai covenant. So jump up to Exodus 24. And absolutely, positively, there's, you got to do this and I'll do that. You could not be more specific. So like in 24:1, I'm just going to skim through this pretty quickly, but God calls to Moses, come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, with these other folks. So we're in book of Exodus, chapter 24, verse 1 and following. You shall bow down at a distance. Moses alone is to come close to the Lord. The others shall not come. When Moses came to the people and related all the words and ordinances of the Lord. Notice, ordinances. When Moses comes back, he's got orders, very clearly laid out what it is they're supposed to do. Ordinances of the Lord, they all answered with one voice. We will do everything that the Lord has told us. Ha! You know how that goes. Moses then wrote down all the words of the Lord. Rising early in the morning, he built at the foot of the mountain an altar of 12 sacred stones for the 12 tribes of Israel. That having sent young men of the Israelites to offer burnt offerings and sacrifice young bulls and communion offerings to the Lord. I mean, all this buildup, right? Moses has come back. He's got a message from God. He stayed up all night writing it. All the young men of the Israelites go off. They set up these 12 marker stones. They're sacrificing, big sacrifice. So this is a huge day. Verse 6, Moses took half of the blood and put it in large bowls. The other half he splashed on the altar. Imagine what that would look like. Well, how many bowls did they have? I just said many bowls. Well, half of one bowl's blood. I'm sure it's a lot. And you take it and you're just throwing this thing up on the altar. Okay? St. Joe's has a pretty big sanctuary. Can you just imagine? Running red with... But guess what, folks? That's all the language we use in our Mass, right? We forget that this precious little, Gallo and Sons, or wherever we get it from, in our nice little gold cup, all that is evocative of the blood of Christ. And as we're reading through these Sundays, right, the Jews being so offended, as Jesus says, eat my flesh, drink my blood. I mean, we've so sanitized it. Take a sip of relatively cheap wine from my beautiful gold chalice. Well, there's nothing offensive about that. You want to be offended? Walk into St. Joe's with a bowl of bull blood. Throw it up on the altar, and you'll have a little sense of what the people in these Gospels, these weeks that we've been reading from chapter 6 of John, the horror that these people were feeling when Jesus is saying, eat my flesh and drink my blood. So this is what Moses does. He takes all this blood, he flings it on the altar. It's literally running red with blood. And why was blood so important, right? These people just weren't into gore. And maybe what you were just telling me about Moses, about Noah. That's right, blood life. So in the Noah covenant that we looked at, something they are told is you can't consume the blood. That's where the life is. So it matters that you throw the blood on the altar. You're giving to God what only God can give. You're giving back to God. So after he's done this, he takes the book of the covenant, okay, which is, we believe, largely the book of Deuteronomy. He read it aloud to the people, and they all answered, "All that the Lord has said, we will hear and do." Gospel of John, Jesus says many times, "Blessed are those who hear the word of God and act upon it." John draws on the covenantal language more than anyone else. He doesn't give us a Last Supper scene, but he draws on the covenantal imagery. And so an important thing about the covenant in the biblical sense, you hear it and you do it. You know, it's not enough just to hear it, you have to act upon it. And you can't just act what you think you should do, you've really got to listen. Those two things go together. Then he took the blood. Okay, you think splashing on the altar was bad, now he's got the other half bowl, he throws it on them. Okay? This is the blood of the covenant, which the Lord has made with you, according to all these words. Say it at every Mass, right? This is the blood, the new and eternal covenant, which will be shed for you for all. Okay? That's where this language comes from. Before you say, oh wait, that's from the Gospel of Matthew, that's from the Gospel of Luke. Jesus is quoting this language. He is choosing that language because he is deliberately putting himself in that continual thread that runs through all of salvation history. That's why we're doing these 4 nights, that it really is the same thing. Jesus isn't just saying, well, that was then, but this is now. He's fulfilling, but to stress the fulfillment, he's literally using the very same language. Because what Moses did, he could only do it once and he would have to repeat it. The high priest would have to repeat it every year. Jesus does it, he never has to do it again because it's eternally ongoing. But this is the language of the covenant, and that was the point that I wanted to get across. Let's go to Exodus 34. And that the sign of that covenant is, it's the book and it's the blood. We all know the story. The people are unfaithful, and so the covenant basically needs to be renewed because the old tablets got broken. So in 34, let's jump down to verse 10. So, just at the beginning of 34, the Lord said to Moses, "Cut 2 stone tablets like the former ones that he had broken, that I may write on them the words which were on the former tablets that you broke," in case you forgot. So then in verse 10, the Lord said, "Here's the covenant I will make. Before all your people I will perform marvels never before done in any nation, anywhere on earth, so that all the people among whom you live may see the work of the Lord. Awe-inspiring are the deeds I will perform with you. As for you, observe what I am commanding you today." Okay, very clear. "I will do all these wonderful things." Incidentally, why does he say he's going to do all these wonderful things? Well, but if you look in verse 10, it's a long verse. "I will do these marvels never done before, so that all the people among whom you live may see the work of the Lord." In other words, in the Mosaic covenant, part of God's great works are to show other people basically how good God is and how special his people are. In other words, he's not just doing these things to be nice to the Israelites. He's doing it to establish for all the other peoples of the world who he is. But they themselves have to follow the commandments. And then he gets very explicit. Verse 11, continuing. "See, I am about to drive out before you the Amorites, Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. Take care not to make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land that you are to enter, lest they become a snare among you." Remember Hosea? He was saying, "Oh, you took up with these false gods, and you broke my heart." He's saying here, don't take up with these other people. They will bring you down. "You tear down their altars, their false altars. Smash their sacred stones. Cut down their Asherahs." Asherah is like a sacred tree. "You shall not bow down to any other god, for the Lord, jealous," there's your word, jealous his name, is a jealous God. If you ever doubt that, go back and read Hosea 2 again. If that wasn't a jealous God, I don't know who is. Do not make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land. He's saying, don't you go doing with them what I do with you. Okay? Do not make a covenant. Else, when they prostitute themselves with their gods and sacrifice to them, one of them may invite you, and you may partake of that sacrifice. And when you take their daughters as wives for your sons, and their daughters prostitute themselves with their gods, they will make your sons do the same. Notice, very, it's talking about the sons there, but it's a two-way street. You shall not make for yourselves molten gods. You shall keep the festival of the unleavened bread. For 7 days at the appointed time, on and on and on. Tells them all the things that they are to do. The point being, this is what they must do to uphold the covenant. So way more than we saw with Moses, way more than we saw with Abraham. This long, long list of here's what you do to uphold the covenant. So that's what's a lot of times how we tend to think of the Mosaic covenant. Now you might ask yourself, well, why? Did God just wake up kind of cranky one day and all of a sudden say, you've got to do all these things? You know, one speculation about these texts from Exodus is that they were composed after the Israelites returned from the exile. So even though they're talking about a time that's the time of Moses, which who knows exactly, maybe 1200 BC, 1300 BC, but the thought is that they were written down in this way, you know, with the very litigious language of you must do this, you must do this, is that after, so in about 500 BC, the Israelites were taken into slavery, or taken into exile in Babylon. They come back home, and then it was this sense of, hey, this happened to us because we really slid off the rails in our relationship with God. What can we do to make sure we really toe the line? Well, we're going to write down everything that we need to do. And so it's thought that, I mean, Leviticus, you get it even more, very careful, that it was an attempt to really remind themselves of what they needed to hold close to. That's a whole other story, but it's a fair question, at least to say, you know, something's really changed here. You know, it's not that God has radically changed his character, but we're given very specific things that the Israelites have to follow. But just to show that our remembering piece is still there, now go up to Leviticus 26.
27.
What?
27.
Yeah, louder, louder.
27, he goes on to say, put it in writing.
Yeah, exactly. Don't forget. And that's where we're going to another example of that, Leviticus 26. Leviticus chapter 26. So you almost never see covenant without the word remember or remind lurking nearby. And sometimes it's the people who have to remember, and sometimes it's God who needs to remember. So in chapter 26 of Leviticus, look at verse 40. That's been this long section where he talks about people, if they break the covenant, they do bad things. Then he's saying in verse 40, but if they confess their iniquity and the iniquity of their ancestors and their treachery against me and in their continued hostility towards me, so that I too had to be hostile to them and bring them into their enemies' lands, then when their uncircumcised hearts are humbled, so they've done bad things, they've broken the covenant, I had to, punish them. But eventually, when their uncircumcised hearts are humbled, notice, their bodies are circumcised, but that doesn't matter. Their hearts are not, okay? So you're already seeing language like, don't just tell me you're doing, don't just talk the talk, you're not walking the walk. So uncircumcised hearts, he says, when eventually they come around, verse 41, so that I too had to, then when their uncircumcised hearts are humbled and they make amends for their iniquity, I will remember my covenant with Jacob, and also my covenant with Isaac, and also my covenant with Abraham, I will remember. The land too I will remember. Okay? So it's just that point. You can break the covenant, I'm going to have to punish you, but eventually you'll repent, we'll let bygones be bygones, because I will remember the covenant. We have, blood is thicker than water. We can fight like cats and dogs, but at the end of the day, we are bound forever by this covenant. You are my people, and I am your God. Which can be incredibly consoling in the midst of dark days and dark times. Moving out of, all the way to the end, if you like, of the Moses cycle, to some of these great Deuteronomy passages. I just want to look at one. Let's look at Deuteronomy 6, the great Shema. So Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4 and following. This is what every observant Jew says in the morning when they wake up. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. So Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 4. Deuteronomy is just a little bit after, right after Leviticus. So a little bit after Exodus. So chapter 6, verse 4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. Therefore you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your being, with all your strength. Take to heart these words which I command you today. Keep repeating them to your children. Recite them when you are at home and when you are away, when you lie down and when you get up. Bind them on your arm as a sign, and let them be as a pendant on your forehead. Write them on the doorpost. So in some sense, this is a small encapsulation of the covenant relationship. I am your God. Keep repeating it. Teach it to your children. Never forget it. Then he goes on and he talks about the stipulations. When the Lord your God brings you into the land which he swore to your ancestors to give you, all these good things. We looked at this yesterday a little bit. Verse 12, be careful not to forget the Lord. Just like you can forget a covenant, you can forget the Lord, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, that house of slavery. The Lord your God shall you fear. Him shall you serve. You shall not go after other gods. Little vestiges of the Ten Commandments in all of this. Verse 16, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test, but keep the commandments of the Lord your God, and the decrees and the statutes he has commanded you. Do what is right and good in the sight of the Lord, that it may go well with you, and you may enter in and possess the good land. Later on, when your sons ask you, what do these decrees and statutes and ordinances mean? Why are we doing all this, Dad? Which the Lord our God has enjoined on you. You shall say, we were once slaves, but the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a strong hand. And then he goes on in chapter 7 to talk about if you do these things, you will be blessed. If you don't do them, you will be cursed. So, in some sense, all throughout the Pentateuch, you start out with that beautiful promise of covenant right at the very beginning. Then you see more and more human involvement, infidelity, breaking the rules, God being faithful. So I would just say it's kind of a maturing relationship. That's my word, not the Bible's. But if you want to try and humanize it a little bit. So let's go up then to where Jesus starts using this language. Well, first,